John, thanks very much, and to you and to everyone here at the Chamber, I want to start by offering a very sincere and heartfelt congratulations for playing such a key leadership role in the All Nations Job Fair that was hosted recently, where 50 employers came together, more than 80 booths, 1,100 people came through the door, and it was just a tremendous success as far as helping to lead Saskatchewan in a direction that's going to help to ensure that more people from right across the province are able to participate in the economy and also see educational opportunities. So to you and to the Chamber, a special note of congratulations and a special thanks. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce a very good friend of mine. George Lafond is our Treaty Commissioner, and I've known George for a little while. He and I have had the opportunity to do some things together. This past summer, he invited me out to Treaty Days at Muskeg Lake, and that's home for George, and provided an opportunity for me to witness a ceremony that is fundamental here within Saskatchewan, and that is those Treaty Days that still represent the very essence and meaning of treaty. George has a pretty extensive background. He was trained originally as a teacher. He was a high school teacher. Then he was elected to the Saskatoon Tribal Council as vice chief, and then as chief, where he did extensive work within that community. He's worked at the University of Saskatchewan as a key liaison and advisor to President Peter McKinnon. Continues in that role under the current president. George then contributed and played a catalytic role in the national panel that went across the country and made a series of recommendations in a report that went to the federal minister regarding Aboriginal education. And everyone that was involved in that process talks about the significance of George Lafond helping to make sure that sensible recommendations were being made based on feedback directly from grassroots. And so I'm absolutely delighted to ask all of you to join me in welcoming this athlete, this intellectual, and this man of action, George Lafond.
Thank you very much, Rob. There's a man who knows what he's talking about. Thank you, Mr. Petra, for your work in prayer, and I want to thank all the people from Treaty 4, the territory that we're on. And I understand that I may be wrong in this, but I'm assuming that the Treaty 4 flag is flying at City Hall today. I don't know the elder that designed that flag, Lake Gordon Nose from the Niigani First Nation. A man that I'm very proud to say I knew quite well, and of course, with Jeremy Morgan in the audience, was very instrumental in the Montesquieu and Heritage Park in its early beginnings. I want to thank the Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to participate in today's lunch. I know you got a very busy holiday season, and finding time for this important message I'm about to give is very critical, I think, to the issues that we're facing here today, not only in Newmarchon, but in Saskatchewan. I have a 2-year appointment, and it's a part-time appointment. For many of you who don't know this, I'm a lot of things, as Rob would say, a lot of things to a lot of people, but more importantly, I'm a father to 4 children. And my wife, Mary Ellen Chappelle Lafond, is the provincial advocate in BC, which means I travel a lot from Victoria to Saskatoon to do my job, to fulfill my duties as a Treaty Commissioner. We left Saskatchewan about 5 years ago. And one of the reasons why we left was to, in some ways, lighten up the load. We were 2 very busy people. Mary Ellen was in the provincial court, and I was working, as Rob says, with the University of Saskatchewan, being an advisor, where we took on some of the major initiatives to create one of the most, I think, probably one of the most comprehensive programming in Canada that saw inclusion of Aboriginal people on campus, and not only in the area of retention, but also in the areas of curriculum change and making sure that colleges respond to the First Nations people's needs and their people. And so we moved to Victoria, believing that we're going to lighten things up. So I had a bit of a contract with the University of Saskatchewan, and I didn't have any employment in Victoria. I assumed that the employment issue would come soon enough. But I remember sitting in my living room and thinking, well, yeah, I have all this free time now. So I started making a list of things that I wanted to do. It was these books that I was going to read and reread, and I was going to learn a little more French and a little more of this and a little more of that. Learn how to cook, actually, was part of it, because we have 4 children. I thought, well, I should learn how to cook. I told the end of the story. I had no idea what broil was. It's always fried something, right? I mean, what's this thing called? Broil. I mean, I knew natural gas. I had no idea what a natural gas oven. But there I was. I made a list. I made a list of 25 things I wanted to do over the next year. And I gave it to Mary. I said, here it is. 25 things I'm going to do. She looked at me and said, why not get a job? so there it began. So get a job. I learned very quickly that you have to have goals, especially when you have free time. And so one of my jobs, of course, that I've taken on, as I said, is this very important job, which is called tree commissioner. We're in a very special time of the year. It's Christmas season, it's a festive season. Certainly an author a long time ago wrote about the Christmas season as being the festival of families. I think for us in First Nation communities, we recognize that. Family is very important to us. It's when many of our people come back to our home communities to be with the old people. And of course, for many small town people, it's a time when many people that live outside the province or in the urban setting come back to small towns, whether it be in Stoughton or whether it be in Piapod or Pasco, whatever it may be. There's a community connection. For me, though, of course, it's to be able to reflect back on a year. And I take a look at some of the things that I've done over this last year. And I think of the 2 things that really decide where you are 5 years ago or even where you were in 1 year. It's the people you meet and, of course, the books you read. And over the last number of years, since I graduated from university a number of years ago, I've read a lot of books about Saskatchewan. And some of the great authors, and Jeremy will remind me of who just won the Governor General's Award, which is Candace Savage. She wrote a wonderful book, just recently won the Governor General's Award. But one of the most important books that I read was called General Friesen's book. He's a great historian out of Manitoba. He was a student of tenure here. He wrote the book, the definitive book, on the Canadian prairies. And the first page of the Canadian prairies basically talks about the 5 geographical landforms that Saskatchewan has. When I thought about 2012, I thought of that because my job allows me to travel across Saskatchewan. So last year, when I started in May, I went to Niganit for the Oaks family, where we had a sweat. And there's a very unique, special part of Saskatchewan. It's the highest point, highest elevation, I believe, in Saskatchewan. But it also has this stand of trees, which is the pine trees. But as you look out over the hills, you can see the first great prairie that begins Saskatchewan. I was able to travel in a vehicle from there all the way up through Saskatoon, and you start passing through the parklands and the grasslands. Where I come from, you're just on the edge of the northern Borealis forest. This, as Robbie says, and Mary was there, we flew up to Orange, and we flew up to Lalanche, and you get to see the Precambrian Shield. So this province talks about the land. You cannot talk about Saskatchewan without talking about the land that formed us. All right? And one of the other things, of course, is the authors that talk about the people. I read a number of books that talk about the people. I think for us who are First Nation, we read about Blair Stoneshaw, his book that talks about the history of the chiefs after the Louis Riel Rebellion. It talks about loyal till death. I think of the book that, as I said, Miss Savage, who wrote about the land in southern Saskatchewan and the people. She talks about Sitting Bull coming across the boundary and what they did. There's other books, of course, Rudy Weed, talk about Big Bear. There's other books about Beverhagen, the English patient. We've got great historians in Saskatchewan called Jim Miller, who writes about the treaties and the signing of treaties and the importance of treaties for all sides. And of course, he talks about this issue of reconciliation. He talks about Shingus. He talks about how the skyscrapers, the cities, the urban and the rural, how it's now becoming very influential in how we see ourselves. But probably one of the most significant books that I read, and I think many of you are familiar with this, and if you're not familiar, I'd recommend you do read it, it's W.O. Mitchell. W.O. Mitchell probably wrote the classic story about Saskatchewan, and we all know the title. It's basically Who We See in the Wind. It is an allegory, of course, the fact that a young boy, 10 years old, coming to grips and coming of age to understand his life and where he fits in the order of life. And the fact that when he talks about who has seen the wind, he's basically saying allegorically who has seen God. And he talks about the fact that he feels wind on his face, but does he really feel God in his heart? And he goes through, if you remember the story W. Mitchell puts you through, he puts his main character through a test. He loses his father, he has to go live somewhere else, he's in a small town, there's a lot of contradictions. His uncle, Uncle Sean, is a bit of a character, swears a lot, which I like. And of course, if you sort of know W. Mitchell, you probably think that's him writing himself into the story. But basically, W. Mitchell talks about this issue. He talks about the land, but he also talks about the spirituality of this province. And he talks about the fact that as prairie people, we seek spirituality. And the reason why I think it's important for us to recognize this is the fact, as we know, as First Nations people, we are very spiritual people. And we are very much connected to the land. When I think about the fact that my grandparents, when I read these books, I think about my grandparents quite a bit, and how they taught me to pray. They taught me to pray in a very Catholic fashion, but I remember at the same time I remember them practicing and burning sweetgrass in the house. So there was a combination of, you had a Western European Catholicism, but at the same time practicing traditional smudging. And I remember, as I said, being 10 years old and watching my grandmother go up a hill every night without fail, doing her prayers. She'd walk up the hill, and we'd walk up behind her, and she'd do her rosary. And I remember standing on the top of the hill, and I would look at the wave of the wheat dancing in the wind, as to who would see the wind. Now, a lot of those issues, of course, come back to haunt you, because you tend to think, who am I, and what am I, and what is my purpose in this life? The who am I becomes very distorted, because I grew up on an Indian reserve. I grew up in I would say, a very sheltered environment. And this is the paradox we have today, is that in my generation, I grew up very sheltered, knowing who I was. Why? Because I grew up on an Indian reserve. Both grandparents there, parents in the house. I knew who I was. I see today with urbanization, a lot of our young people, this issue of who we are, which is a right. It's a right to know who you are, is being tested. But yet, what I see on reserve, as I've seen myself growing up in the 60s, to the situations where they are in 2012, you have a compromise. You can know who you are, but be isolated. In other words, the opportunities that the world that is out there isolates you, because what's happening is not happening in Muscat Lake. It's happening in Saskatoon. It's happening in Regina. It's happening in Calgary. It's happening in Tokyo. So the compromise, the challenge that I faced when I was growing up wasn't there. I grew up knowing who I was. Safe, secure, around people who were very spiritual and very confident because they knew who they were. However, there was also an elephant in the room. Both my parents went to residential school. The shifting of my grandparents and who they were to my parents, you could see the difference. The difference, of course, is that the parents that were there weren't there. My mother, beautiful woman, my father, a veteran of 2 wars. Tough. You go to work, or you go to the army. One choice. My mother, you go to work, or you go to school. Let me think about that. Let me think about that very clearly. One option, basically, which was go to school. I wasn't going to go to the army, and I was too young to go to work. So I went to school. I went to school, and I knew quite clearly, and Leanne knows this because she's a pitcher, she's a world-class pitcher. I knew very quickly that the count against me was 2-2. It was a pitcher's count. I had no control of the next pitch. All I knew was I had to make sure if I was going to hit that next ball coming over the plate, I had to hit it hard, and I had to run. I knew I had no other options. If I swing, I miss, I'm out of the game. So I take a look at what my generation did with that opportunity, and I saw a number of people that proceeded into their careers, but not at a rate that was acceptable for me to believe that this world was an inclusive world. It wasn't acceptable to see my relatives not make it in the world, not even make it off the reserve, or not even make it on the reserve, because as I said, the opportunities became less and less every generation. You couldn't make it on hunting and fishing. You couldn't make it chopping wood. You couldn't make it on the jobs that were provided to First Nation communities. So the anger, the frustration that I grew up in was also something that I had to deal with. A lot of my young people who I grew up with, the cohort that I grew up with, were very, very angry, very upset. And they manifested that anger into destructive decisions, whether it be alcohol and drugs or violence. Now, growing up, of course, quickly I moved from my reserve to Saskatoon. And there I was already got to see another part of the world. I also got to see, and I got to meet with a number of other people, as I said, some things that make you change from where you are today and where you are tomorrow are the people you meet and the books you read. I met a lot of people. I met many people from First Nation communities. I'm a nationalist. I think Musket Bay is the best reserve in Saskatchewan. I told people that. Then I met people from Poundmaker who had the same belief. I met people from Muscopine who had the same belief. I had met people from Standing Buffalo who had the same belief. I met people from First Nation communities because I was allowed to participate in an environment because I knew who I was. I had the ability to say, hey, who are you? What are you doing? What are you doing here? What are you studying? I also met non-Aboriginal people. I went to school with some very good people. I worked across the table with them on a lot of issues in Saskatchewan. I came across a number of people on campus who went on to become people leaders in their own field. This hotel, at this time of the year, in about 2 weeks' time, Robbie, are going to be filled with people going to youth parliament. I was here in the mid-70s going to youth parliament. I met people who are now lawyers and doctors. We were only 15, 16 years old. Indian boy from Muscat, small white boy from Davidson. We knew that we couldn't make it alone. We had to know each other. I had to know who he was. He had to know who I was. Because we already knew that the image for Saskatchewan was us. He knew who he was as a small boy from Davidson with a dream to be a lawyer. And I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a teacher. But we knew that we had to go through the same channels together. We had to go to university to get that. And so for me, the opening up was the people I met not only gave me strength from my own First Nation perspective from various reserves, because they too were struggling as I was. I didn't think I was alone. I saw people from Poundmaker or Lafond struggling. I said, if they're making it, I'm going to make it. As I often said, I said at the time we spoke at the Ochakwis people, I may have not always won, but I was never a loser. But I tell you, there were times I did feel like giving up. A lot of times in my life I said, it'd probably be easier for me back on the reserve. Why am I doing this to myself? Why am I putting myself through this? But I knew that I had to continue on. And where that comes from, of course, is the fact that I saw other people, First Nations people, leading the charge. We're seeing more and more of that in my time, even more and more of that in today's time. Professionally, the same thing happened. I've been able to go from a First Nation, where I met Todd in the Saskatoon Tribal Council, where I was a leader, and Todd was a leader in the urban development, to working in non-Aboriginal communities in their environments. This is where I met Robert Haynes, the Vice President of Sask Energy, sitting on the board. Small town people, small town reserve people, working together in enterprise to make Saskatchewan a better place. I don't think anybody grows up and says, we want to hurt the other side. I don't think anybody grows up and says, we want to damage the future of Saskatchewan because we're going to have racism, structural racism put in place and we're going to keep it there. It's like apartheid. I don't think people understand the issues of the Indian Act and say, we want to keep the Indian Act. I think there's many people out there who go to work every day and work every day, such as yourselves, to make sure we have inclusion. But the end goal keeps getting farther and farther apart. I've been criticized because of my age and because of the fact that maybe people say, well, you've been very successful. It's easy for you to say that because you have some element of success in your life. My view is I said, look, I know where I was in the 70s. I know where I am now in 2012. We've come a great distance. Let me tell you the struggles we had in the 60s and 70s, as I said, going to university and coming off the reserve. It was difficult. As I said, I saw my brothers and sisters fail. What we're challenged by today is the amount of change that we need to make today is more than the change that I've seen over 30 years. Because the young people are not waiting. And they're frustrated because they say the change we need is more deeper. It's not superficial anymore. We need to actually make real change in the world we see ourselves in. The Indigenous child today needs to see themselves as who they are. Anishinaabe, Cree, Lakota, Dene, they need to see themselves and feel proud about themselves so they're strong enough to take on what God may give them or what the world may challenge them with. So my role as a treaty commissioner, when I take a look at these issues and come to a concluding point, is that we're in a very, very unprecedented environment. How do we create that environment that was there in the 1800s? This is what's important for us to understand. Treaties were a document that weren't signed under duress. The cavalry was not at the door saying, sign or you lose, as it was in the lower states, as it was in America. We all know the manifest destiny that took place in America. This was an agreement between a settler society and a First Nation society that both agreed to live together in harmony. No duress, no coercion, an agreed upon principle of coexistence, or as I would say, a word that we use today, it's a word of reconciling. We knew the past as Indigenous leaders was our ability to maintain and sustain our lives through the buffalo was passing. We saw disease. We needed to reconcile with that. The European settlers saw this as an opportunity for them to move from an old world to a new world. They reconciled also the fact that their world was changed and they were coming here to start a new world. But they dealt with us as partners. They reconciled with themselves, and we reconciled the fact that we were not going to go away, and nor were they. A form of reconciliation occurred on the prairies. We reconcile. We forgive what's happened to us through disease and destruction, and you reconcile because you know you're about to gain something through a treaty. The reconciliation took place. There was high hope for reconciliation in the 1800s, but that reconciliation didn't take hold. Why? Because the Indian Act then came in place. We were subjugated under an act that basically said, everything that you do from here on in, including the hideous use of child policy of residential school, of taking the Indian out of the child, was implemented. And we talk about the issue of knowing who you are and knowing who you and where you're from. That is completely taken out of your control and given to a third party. So can we ever, as treaty people, and can we ever, as a settler society, in this part of the country where everybody is watching what we're doing, because this is where, if something was going to happen, it's going to happen here in Saskatchewan. We have the highest population, the highest demographic, the youngest Aboriginal population, and yet one of the fastest growing and booming economies in Canada. Well managed, well structured, poised to take on the world. The world discovered us in 2005 because they want the commodities. And that's what we do. Our productivity is high, not as good as it should be, but there's a thin veneer right now, as we all know that, because the world economy is a bit shaken with Europe, America, and Asia. But we're still strong. We still have muscle on the bone. And yet, as I say this, First Nations people are looking for their place inside this world because they're grappling with the issue of who are we in the 21st century? I say to you, and I'll conclude with this, it is reconciliation. Now, I've said this to a number of people. It's easier said than done. What is reconciliation? I've gone to elders, as I learned when I was a tribal leader, always go to your elders. What does reconciliation mean to you? What does it mean? Some elders will say to me, I will never forgive, and I'll never forget. A very hard approach to the future. I respect that. I've gone to another elder in the same room and I'll say, what does reconciliation mean to you? And the elder will say, I've reconciled what happened to me. I have forgiven what has happened to me and my family and my culture and my language. The reason why I do it is because we cannot bring hatred into our hearts of our young people. Our young people should feel free that they can be anything, knowing who they are in their language and in their culture. But they should also feel free that they can take their place in Saskatchewan, whether it be working for Indigenous people or whether they just simply working for a crown corporation or a company or having their own companies. He says, that's the next generation. We must forgive and move on. Because we're not talking about only a strong Indian community, we're talking about a strong Saskatchewan community. We must reconcile. We must find ways of reconciliation. It's the only way through. Justice Sinclair came through town in June. Robbie was there. Many of you were there. Leanne, I think, was there. Truth and reconciliation. A difficult task.